Greetings, everyone. My name is Sergei Berkatovsky, also known as Sir B. I am the lead game designer at Wargaming. I am here to answer your questions.
What is the most important feature of the new Chinese tanks?
The most important thing about Chinese tanks is that the country attempted to create their own tank army, as well as establish their own tank industry under the restrictions of wartime and overall post-war breakdown, while having weak manufacturing capabilities and many other problems. And look at the details of that region, too. It was seriously influenced by the Soviet Union and slightly affected by Japan and the USA. Chinese engineers managed to create very interesting and unique vehicles.
How do they differ from other countries' lines, especially the Soviet Union's tanks?
First, take the line of Chinese light tanks. These are very similar to T-54s, only smaller and lighter versions of them. You'll be surprised to find out that in comparison to the light tanks of other countries, the Chinese ones are worthy adversaries. Why is that? Remember that if you think of China as the potential area of operations, T-54s won't be able to drive through all its mountains and swamps and other landscape features. The lighter version, created by Chinese engineers who kept all that in mind, these vehicles are known as the Premium Tank Type 62, was able to drive everywhere effectively. When we talk about medium tanks, though, the factors I mentioned before come into play. The main thing is that the Chinese industry after World War II almost completely collapsed due to the destruction wrought by Japan, and it was even worse after the Civil War. So in order to upgrade the T-34-85 to newer versions, Chinese engineers decided to take a different path. You see, everybody knows how Soviet engineers moved from the T-34 to the T-54. First, they added torsion bar suspension, as we know, to the T-43. Then they moved the engine, as we see in the T-44. Chinese engineers took another route. They took the T-34 as their base and tried to make it resemble the T-54. So the T-34-1, which is very much like the T-43, and the T-34-2, which is closely related to the T-44, are interim models which have no equivalent in the Soviet Union. Then the Chinese obtained a license to produce the T-54, which was known in their armed forces as the Type 59. Later, relations between the Soviet Union and China worsened, and the Chinese had to build more advanced tanks all by themselves. The Soviet Union constructed the T-62A with a 100mm high-power gun and high-quality shells, and then the T-62 with its smooth-bore gun. But the Chinese engineers again chose an alternative path, keeping their own unique needs and resources in mind. They enlarged the Type 59, gave it a bigger turret, and equipped it with a 120mm gun, the equivalent of a T-10 or IS-8 gun, speaking in terms of World of Tanks. So the medium tank in the Chinese line is unique in having the largest caliber gun of all tanks in its class. And this alone means that the vehicle is exceptional and will interest players. Speaking of heavy tanks, the Chinese have some unusual tanks for us again. We'll restrict ourselves to Project 111. There were 5 different vehicles produced under this project. And that's why we're able to put the tank into 2 classes. You'll see a variety of guns there, beginning with the standard A-19 of 1943 up to 130mm guns. There are plenty of armor variations too, so these vehicles are really interesting. It's another matter that, like many other heavy tanks, by the time Project 111 was released, heavy tanks were not really relevant anymore. But these vehicles came into existence anyway. One tank is preserved in a museum, and you're going to see it in the game. And maybe we'll release something else later on, also authentic and also Chinese.
Would you please tell us why you decided to extend the timelines? You used to take tanks built before the 50s, but things are different with this Chinese line.
We never really strictly stuck to those timelines. We could have extended the timelines even further, but it would be less interesting. At a certain point in time, you'll see things like guided missiles, reactive armor, and other complicated, sophisticated high-tech stuff of that sort. As you see, we chose a time when tanks were still a significant military force, but they weren't completely decisive. These are pre-war and early post-war tanks. So this separation takes place somewhere between the T-62 and the T-60. We don't want to introduce smoothbore guns to the game, because they can use guided projectiles. And this means that the battle ranges are so far out that you end up aiming at tiny dots. So, it's obvious that this is where we have to draw our dividing line. And all those dates, 1955 or 1960, they are just relative. For example, after deliberation and a lot of talk, we decided to introduce the German Leopard 1 tank. The Leopard comes from a generation of tanks that are not fully automated, and it is quite competitive compared to the other countries' tanks of those times. While we don't stick to specific dates, we choose vehicles for the game very carefully.
Why did you decide to introduce a new line instead of improving the old ones?
First, in the same patch that brings in the Chinese tanks, we made a lot of improvements to the American line, including adding another American top-tier heavy tank. Second, the work on other lines continues. I really wonder why people think it must be black or white. When we work on one thing, do you think we drop everything else? Come on, guys. Everything happens in its own time. There's no need to panic. Besides, real men don't panic.